Hello, today I wanted to talk about GDP per capita as a metric of quality of life, the pros and cons of using GDP per capita, as well as alternative. GDP per capita used to be a really great metric for quality of life. When our economy just started to grow a lot, it was almost a one-to-one correlation between quality of life and GDP per capita, but that's no longer necessarily the case. The idea of GDP per capita is essentially the more income you have, the more you can consume, and our economy is based on consumption. Effectively, everyone has unlimited desires, and the more income they can have, the more they can consume, and that will increase their quality of life. At least that's the theory. There are a few flaws with that. One being a higher income doesn't necessarily mean a lower cost of living or an equal cost of living. For instance, a GDP per capita of $100,000 in San Francisco isn't really as good as a GDP per capita of $70,000 in a typical city in Texas. Cost of living is much lower and you have a lot more disposable income. And with the cost of housing so high as a percentage of your income, we're not necessarily gaining a lot from the GDP growth. You can also look at this. You see a GDP per capita of $100,000 and assume that sounds great. But in San Francisco, the cost of living is so high, you're not going to have much disposable income. Of course, you could use disposable income per capita as a metric of quality of life. The idea being you take away your living expenses like housing, taxes, and then what you're left with is your disposable income. But it's a bit complicated whether you should include taxes or not, because in some countries, healthcare is included in taxes, and some social safety net programs are effectively like insurance programs, like unemployment or disability or social security. And then there's also the fact that not all housing is equal. If you pay $300 a month for a 30 square foot apartment, your disposable income will be higher, but it's debatable, I guess, depending on the person, whether the quality of life is higher or lower, even though the disposable income would be higher. I don't personally have a problem living in smaller spaces, but some people might. Same thing could apply to all other aspects of living. You spend a tiny percentage of your income on food, but it's just rice and beans. Is your quality of life really higher just because you have more disposable income? I guess all these metrics as quality of life are somewhat subjective. For a long time, we focused on GDP growth as a metric of success, but I want to point out that another way we could increase people's disposable income without necessarily changing would be to lower the cost of living. And you can think about a country versus a corporation, for instance. A corporation may focus on revenue growth, and the higher the revenue, the more the profit. That's kind of like GDP growth for a country. At the same time, companies can also focus on cost cutting, bringing down the cost of production in order to increase profit instead of just focusing on revenue growth. The same thing could be done at a country level. Instead of focusing on GDP growth, we could focus on bringing down the cost of housing. If you bring down the cost of housing by $1,000 a year, and that's effectively the equivalent of an $1,000 a year increase in GDP per capita, because either way, people get an extra $1,000 in their pocket. You decrease the cost of living by $1,000 a year, or if you increase the GDP per capita by $1,000 a year, the effect is the same. And that's something we could focus on as an alternative to GDP growth. Of course, increasing the GDP per capita should be a goal, but it doesn't need to be our only goal. We could also focus on bringing down the cost of living in order to increase the disposable income of everyone. We've been focusing on GDP per capita for a long time because it used to be so connected to quality of life increases, but it's not necessarily that GDP per capita increases are not as connected to quality of life increases as they used to be. A lot of people point to the improvements in technology growth, like computers and things like that have increased our quality of life. But that's not necessarily GDP growth. That's more about innovation and research and development. Of course, GDP growth can be sort of tied to that, but it's not one and the same thing. And that's another thing we could focus on is funding research and development. Come up with innovations to increase the quality of life. Another way we could increase their quality of life is by lowering the amount of hours people work. I think a 3-day, 36-hour work week would be really good, because at the end of the day, people are usually tired to do anything, whether it's an 8-hour work day or a 12-hour work day. But of course, not all businesses can work like that. Then a 4-day work week might be good for some, giving people more free time to pursue their hobbies and start a business or do whatever it is they want to do would be a positive thing for quality of life. Another flaw with GDP per capita I hinted at earlier is with healthcare, the fact that we don't include that, the fact that people have to pay for healthcare privately versus other countries that's included in taxes, and that can lead to lower costs for healthcare. So it's kind of like a higher cost of living thing. Like if you're making $60,000 in Sweden versus $80,000 in the US, there's so many things that lead to cost of living increases in the United States, whereas healthcare is just included in Sweden, paid for by taxes. Sometimes higher income leads to more stress. Some of the really high income jobs can be extremely stressful stressful, versus the lower income jobs sometimes can be simpler. Not always the case, but it can be. And if a job is really stressful, that can lower someone's quality of life. So I really think we can increase people's quality of life by cutting the cost of living, getting the cost of housing down. That will increase people's disposable income, and we can lower the amount of working hours, maybe by incentivizing a 3-day 36-hour work week and a 4-day work week, providing tax incentives. Government jobs and government contractors, the U.S. government can require a 3-day work week or a 4-day work week, depending on what works there. Incorporating healthcare into our tax system to ensure that everyone gets healthcare. Of course, there's so many ways we can do that. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the traditional way. And I think disposable income can be a useful metric for quality of life. Maybe not a complete metric, but a useful one. We can aim to increase the disposable income as well as GDP per capita. Anyway, that's about all. Giving my general thoughts on GDP per capita as a quality of life metric.